Story 1. It was when I started learning about other religions and realized how many different beliefs there are. It made me question why the one I grew up with was the right one, and opened my eyes to how much of it depends on where you're born. Kind of made me step back and reevaluate everything. Story 2. When COVID happened, a close family member of mine who had cancer died. We went to the same church, although at this point I was starting to back away from religion. Anyway, what really solidified my decision to fully back out was when I found out that multiple members of the church visited my sick family member while having COVID, hugged them, touched them, and went to their house multiple times. This obviously led to my family member being infected and dying, considering the cancer. When they died, all the church went to the funeral and kept saying how they were such a fighter, and only God knows why he took them from us so early, and literally didn't think or acknowledge that they were at fault. It really pissed me off, and I've never looked back since. Story 3. I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist in a small town with a very strict minister. To say we were devout was an understatement. My first song was Jesus Loves Me. We went to church more days than not in a year. Then I was sexually assaulted by a member of our community, both a church and a local officer who served our county. I was 9, and I was told that when Jesus' second coming happened, I would not rise to heaven with my family. I would cease to exist because I was a heathen running around, chopping off your hair, and luring men. I understood what he was saying my consequences were. But at that time, I knew nothing about what happened or why, because no one explained. I just remember a lot of fighting between my mom and grandma over me, and her telling my mom she's coming with me until you pull your head out of your ass and press charges. I left that community at that point with my grandma, and as I grew up and sorted out everything and reconsidered things with therapists, I realized I could never walk into an evangelical church again. Story 4. One of my good friends throughout high school was really involved with the Catholic Church. She volunteered. She helped with teen masses. She sang in the choir. Everyone knew her. The first year out of high school, she got pregnant with her son, and everyone in the church, the same people who knew her since she was 12, completely shunned her. She kept her son, didn't consider anything to the contrary, and wanted to raise him in the church but was completely ignored and tossed aside when she said she wasn't marrying the father. She was heartbroken, and her whole world was rocked because so much of her life was devoted to the church. They couldn't see past her out-of-wedlock mistake. That's when I realized the people who were supposed to be the spiritual family were horrible people. So much judgment and condemnation. They spoke horribly about her even after she stopped going. At that point, more than a few of us left the church around the same age who knew her, and other than the occasional wedding and funeral, I haven't been back. Story 5. When I was learning to be a pediatrician, I would go to work and watch honest, caring, good parents scream and cry to God to save or protect their baby and have them die horrible deaths, only to go to church and have people talk about how good and real God was to help them find their keys because they prayed. That level of functional discrepancy got to be far too much to overlook. Story 6. Pushing their political beliefs onto their congregation. You wonder why America is so messed up. It's because our pastors preach politics instead of morality. If an evangelical Christian met Jesus, they would throw a fit over how woke he is. Story 7. Reading the Bible cover to cover did it for me. The contradictions and outdated morals didn't align with the kindness and logic I believed in. I realized I didn't need religion to be a good person. Story 8. I remember the exact moment. I was walking through secondary school and just had an epiphany. There are loads of people here with lots of different beliefs. Why is one more correct than the others? Can't be, so what is the point? Just don't be unkind, and you'll be fine. Story 9-1. Asking questions. 2. Getting upset at clerical abuse. 3. Learning and realizing how much the church damaged my self-esteem, body image, my thought process, my ability to think critically, my sense of agency, my relationships and friendships, the way I thought about sexuality, my sense of what is and isn't a big deal in the world, and so on. The hypocrisy of some of the people along with church leaders. 5. Their involvement in politics. That's all I could think of right now, but there is definitely more. Story 10. I'm a woman, and there are very few religions in the world where I am not considered a second-class citizen. More than that, none of them felt quite right. If there is a higher consciousness or being that made all this, it seems silly and shallow to give them basic human emotions, reducing them to being petty, selfish, and wanting our devotion. Story 11. Oddly, religion. I learned more about world religion and realized my version cannot be correct. Therefore, all are incorrect. Religion is helpful for people, and that's great, but religion also is a cause for a lot of pain and suffering, so it became hard to commit with all this in mind. Story 12. Tons of self-reflection and YouTube videos. Interestingly enough, I was convinced my birth religion was immoral by the time I was 12 or 13, but it took until I was 16 for me to be convinced it wasn't true, if that makes sense. Story 13. Growing up in an extremely abusive home, I'd hear, "Oh, God will save you if you pray." I'd see other people getting saved, and they'd say, "Oh, God saved them." But yet he was not there for me. Story 14. It's funny. I've lived mostly in religious conservative states, raised Christian by my parents, kindly Christians, but I've landed as agnostic myself these days. I think I always would have struggled to believe in a God for sure, but the deal breaker has been watching almost every single religious person in my life actively disobey the commands of Jesus day to day. The man preached, for the most part, radical kindness and love. And aside from my parents, every person who ever taught me about that love ultimately proved they never understood it at all. I'm not a perfect guy, and I wouldn't call myself a Christian, but I'd shake Jesus' hand well before most of his followers. Story 15. I'm Catholic. The people at the top protect child predators constantly, and I felt absolutely disgusted to the point I left religion for a while. I kind of came back to religion because I realized I had no obligation to listen to any nonsense they express, and I can just keep my religious faith without really participating in said religion, if that makes sense. Story 16. I grew up Christian but started to question my faith in my early teens. One night, I went for a walk under the moonlight. I tried to talk to God. I told him I was losing hope and faith. I felt guilty asking for anything when I knew God might already be doing so much for everyone around the world. But I asked for a sign anyway. I begged for a sign that he existed. I did not want to believe that God was not real. The next day, my uncle tried to rape me. I told my mother later that day, and she walked away, then lied and told the family I was a promiscuous drug addict. My family turned against me and protected him. It has been 15 years, and I still do not talk to them. That day, I stopped believing in God. Story 17. I grew up Mormon, and two things ultimately drove me away. One, my own readings of the scriptures. None of it made any sense after a while, and it just seemed more and more like fantasy. Two, I hated the way the church treated my mother. She was never a full member of the church, and they always treated her as a second-class citizen because of it. Story 18. I have said this before in another similar thread, but in essence, I stopped feeling spiritual if I ever actually did. Almost everyone around me growing up was religious and seemed to get some kind of fulfillment from their worship. Around my mid-teens, I grew very disillusioned by it all because I just did not feel anything during religious activities anymore like I thought everyone else did. As the Fray once put it, all my days spent by a telephone that never rang. To this day, I still feel the same and still wonder if everyone is just faking religious fulfillment but are all too afraid to look too deep into it. Not that I judge, but that is just kind of how I feel. Story 19. Reading the Bible in depth and realizing how much I was taught in church didn't match up and how much the Bible contradicts itself after having it drilled into my head, how amazing it was to have this huge book that never contradicts itself. So amazing it must have been written by God. Story 20. My parents beat me every day for having symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I knew something was wrong with me, but they told me that I was lazy and selfish and hated them and God. I had no one else to turn to, so I prayed to God every day to show them how hard I was trying to please them. I prayed for help with all symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which I didn't know I had at the time, although teachers definitely mentioned it to my parents, and the only change that happened was my parents became harsher with their punishments. I did that for over a decade with no response. I read the Bible cover to cover multiple times, and I saw all the other kids at church who believed and were able to make friends and who loved and trusted their parents to help them. I finally just gave up on it. Then, when I noticed how the ineffable Word of God could be interpreted to fit any agenda, It really raised a lot of questions. Story 21. My younger brother was being molested by a person who worked at the church, which made headlines involving over 35 children. I have also witnessed the hypocrisy of individuals who profess to be Christian, Catholic, or followers of faith, yet fail to practice kindness and compassion toward others, mainly seen with Christian conservatives. Story 22. I grew up in a Roman Catholic family and the sort of big community churches that surrounded it. I still believe the entire community around this religion, in the way I experienced it, is a net positive thing. But the priest would talk during service about God speaking to him, which I thought was pretty amazing. After Mass one day, as a 12-year-old or something, I asked him what God's voice sounded like. That was the day I realized what was going on. Story 23. Growing up in a strict religious home, I noticed most of us stopped going to church after moving out. Freedom made us question what we were forced into. Story 24. The pastor of the church my father dragged us to growing up proved incapable of following his own rules over time. The first one was on his way to becoming like Jim Jones. That whole church was just strange. Praying for family members not in the congregation to die, deacons selling drugs, predicting the end of the world, etc. The one after that got caught with his secretary on his desk in his office at the church. After that came the wife beater. By the time the next pastor arrived, I had checked out of religion altogether. I don't know what happened with that church, but I was tired of the hypocrisy, and I was only 13. Story 25. Had doubts for years that left me guilt-ridden. Woke up one day and kind of just realized I did not believe anymore, and why should I feel guilty? If I do not believe in hell or eternal punishment, what was there to be afraid of? The day it clicked, it was like a huge weight had been lifted. I slept like a baby that night. Story 26. Parents took me every week for 18 years. I was always put off by the anti-LGBT undertones. My church was pretty don't ask, don't tell with the youth group, but not explicitly bad. It was hard to square the circle on some of the logic and science stuff too. But I got the whole faith thing. I genuinely respected the philosophy and teachings of Jesus. As I grew, I saw more and more that many religious people didn't care about being civil servants, didn't care about true charity or acceptance or forgiveness, and that really disappointed me. It all got really discouraging when simultaneously I was figuring out that I was a transgender woman and my parents' church changed head pastors to an inflammatory, Make America Great Again Republican. Eventually, they did some horrible sermons that were bigoted, hateful, and just incredibly against everything Jesus ever said, and my parents kept going. No fun. Anyway, I have nothing against personal religion. I think people should be able to have faith and express their beliefs in ways that build community and personal peace if they want, as long as it doesn't hurt others. I think that there are good churches and good religious people from all religions. I'm just not going to go to a Southern Baptist church anytime soon. And if I have kids, I kind of don't want them near it. Story 27. Learning that Christians co-opted pagan celebrations to eliminate them. Christ wasn't born in December. Shepherds don't watch flocks in the winter. Winter and spring solstices are pagan and generally about fertility, but Christianity couldn't have that, so they made up Christmas and Easter. It's the hypocrisy. And why is religion so obsessed with sex? Story 28. I felt a sense of inauthenticity from the people at church and couldn't shake off that feeling of being around fake people. Luckily, I asked my parents not to go to church anymore, and thankfully they were okay with it. Story 29. 1. The obvious hypocrisy of the believers around me. Lack of evidence for the very big claims that were being made. Inconsistent and contradictory statements in the theology. I am too individualistic to be part of that kind of hierarchy. Discovering smart, rational humanists who had really good points of view that made much more sense to me. Overcoming the fear associated with leaving the religion. Story 30. When I got old enough to comprehend the concepts, I felt skeptical. I felt worse about how much money my dad would donate to our super church in Vegas. I decided there was nothing wrong with spirituality, but I disagreed with how the church worked. Story 31. I went to a Catholic school from kindergarten to 8th grade and believed until I started questioning around 4th grade when we began learning about science. It was confusing to go from science class, where we were graded on our ability to apply the scientific method and evaluate claims for evidence, to then go to religion class where we were told to just believe. That's why they call it faith. On top of that, I learned that my faith was supposedly in contrast to science on things like evolution and the age of the earth. One had evidence and the other was just in an old book. We were also learning about history, and I realized that people from the time when the Bible was written lived in a very different world than we do now. We've invalidated many of their illogical beliefs, like the earth being flat, so why are we keeping this tradition alive uncritically? More logical inconsistencies started arising, like when we would study the story of the Good Samaritan, yet I would go home and my supposedly Christian parents would be complaining about homeless and poor people taking advantage of the system. Then the anti-LGBTQ issues started becoming apparent as I got into middle school, which really didn't sit right with me because Jesus' whole message is to love everyone. He literally gave up all of his material possessions to wander the world helping people who were societal outcasts. And you're telling me that he is telling us to hate people? More logical inconsistencies arose between science, the Bible, and American Christianity that made me stop believing in middle school. Once we started learning about other religions, I realized your religion largely depends on where you are born. It never sat right with me that God was supposedly condemning a large part of the world's population to hell simply based on where they were born. How is someone who lives in an uncontacted indigenous tribe supposed to find their way to God in heaven? Overall, Jesus, if real, seemed like a really good person whose overall message was to love everyone unconditionally and do as much as you can to end human suffering, which is great. The institution of Christianity and the way it's skewed to boost political motives is not. And there is simply no solid evidence for a God. So until you can show me something solid, it's a no from me.